You can hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you.
Perfect.
Yeah. So the goal of this interview is to understand how to navigate the healthcare startup space. My little experience I've had in the healthcare industry in Canada is that the healthcare industry and the decision makers in the industry are in insular spaces. It's really hard to break into those spaces. And so you can have a great product, you can have a great team, but you still need to break into those spaces to gain any traction. So I just wanted you to start by talking about whether this is something you found to be true in your own assessment and how you have, navigated this.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think even in the little time that I've been working, the enthusiasm and the interest in digital health startups and working in the healthcare space in Canada has changed. So I think we're headed in the right direction. My experience is mostly in the acute hospital space. So as an emergency physician, for the last 15 years, that's sort of the world I live in. So most of my experience would be specific to innovation and quality improvement and adoption of digital health technologies in the acute care hospital space. So when I was chief of when I was chief of the Brand Pacific Emergency Department from about 2014 to 2019, I started to see there's a huge opportunity for adopting digital health technologies to improve patient care, optimize flow, improve sort of the physician or clinician experience. And so my first experience with that was on the public procurement side. And I think I can speak to that. Do you want me to speak to that for a bit?
Sure, yeah.
So what I discovered is that, like, on the public procurement side, we have laws that govern the adoption of any new service technology that at a certain point require something called a request for proposal, so a public, transparent process to adopt new things. And because of that, it makes it very difficult to pilot new companies. Those type of request for proposal processes tend to favor incumbent larger organizations that can meet sort of the requirements that are set out and have the resources to go searching for these RFPs and apply for them. What I've never understood, or what's interesting, is that despite the process in theory being very transparent and rigorous or well written, there's actually a lot of opaqueness in the process. There's all these ways around it, and inconsistencies from hospital to hospital or system to system, and how those are done. And so it comes down to sort of where there's a will, there's a way. So on the public side, as a system leader, it came down to figuring out a specific problem, finding a solution that addressed that problem, and then working through the system with making individual connections and relationships to try and set up pilots. Now, there's multiple ways to do that, right? There's the research pathway. We can talk a little bit about the pros and cons of research, or more of an operational pilot, quality improvement, a less sort of rigorous research approach, right? And so what I found was, do you want me to speak on some specific examples?
Sure, that's good.
I'm not sure. I'm sure it's allowed. But so, for example, early on, as chief, we decided to become an early adopter of a digital solution that optimized physician scheduling in such a way that it used quite a rigorous data-driven approach that didn't exist before to inform how to schedule ER physicians. And on the other side, also provided a very user-friendly application for physicians to provide their preferences. And so it fixed it was a bit of a win-win in that it improved physician experience, both in terms of their personal scheduling and and health and wellness, but also improved patient outcomes via more granular, data-driven approach to how to schedule physicians. And so that particular product, the only way we got it across the line was that in Ontario, emergency departments have specific discretionary funding called the Pay for Performance program, which rewards departments with a certain amount of funding depending on their performance every year, and it can be applied to exactly this: new projects, new net projects that can potentially continue to improve flow. And so what happens is you can easily set up a pilot that then, once you've proven has some outcome, you can make a decision to continue to use the funding that's available to you through this Pay for Performance program, or absorb it into your global budget of the hospital because of its ongoing benefits to the operations of your department. And so the difficulty there was that the cost of it did require a request for proposal, and navigating, from my experience in Canada at least, navigating that process was mostly ultimately about developing individual relationships with key deciders, and making the case for and selling the product to those deciders, and not so much to the end user. So I think the thing that on sort of a macro level that's important or difficult in healthcare is the people making the decisions or who sign the checks have a particular incentive that's different from potentially the end user, which is often, in the case of a hospital system, the clinicians, right, and the patients, right? So you have three people that you need to satisfy in order to adopt. And so as a startup, on the other side, you want to think about those end users and try to find a product or a pain point that you can solve that's at the nexus. If you don't have all three, so the payer, the provider, and the patient lined up, and you know that's a common term that's or a common sort of theme that comes up in regardless of the healthcare systems, whether it's our single insurer, publicly funded, privately delivered healthcare system, or the more complex systems like the U.S., which have a combination of various payment models. Ultimately, the most important thing for any startup looking to navigate the healthcare space is to not forget about any one of those users. And then going back to sort of my experience, I'm just going to stop for a second. Are you okay? Is this going well?
This is going well. This is fine.
You're okay with the way you're going to cut it up and edit it?
That's fine. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And so from a clinician point of view, I think sometimes the early mistakes we make as clinicians trying to take advantage or trial or adopt new technologies in the healthcare system is not recognizing that it's not enough to have something that's just patient, that clearly has a benefit on the patient outcome. You also have to think about how does this benefit the person who's ultimately signing the check, right? And often what gets forgotten is so projects that don't get greenlit, it's because you haven't really understood the pain point of the person signing the check, which can be a director of a department, a VP of a hospital system, VP of a clinical, outpatient clinical entity, a government decider with a pocket of funding. Is that they don't get greenlit because you haven't thought about their needs. And then projects that do get greenlit that aren't successful are usually because they haven't thought about the clinician needs, right? And so the classic example at a sort of large scale is the adoption of new electronic medical records, right? A lot of EMR systems, traditionally haven't really excited or delighted clinicians, right? But they do a good job for patients and for provider systems, so the people signing the checks, right? And so getting those three end users all in line and happy is probably the biggest challenge.
All right. Yeah, and what I understand is that we have to understand the incentives primarily first of the decision makers and design solutions that involve their interests. Now,
Yeah.
I'd like you to talk about how an outsider, someone like me, can even get to meet these people, because cold emails will almost never work. You often have to get an introduction from someone they know, and it's often easier to convince people when you talk to them face to face. And how would an outsider get to meet such people?
Yeah, and that's a good question, and I think the biggest challenge about connecting innovators like yourself who are in the system but not as a medical student. Imagine yourself as an innovator who's not even a medical student, right, but who's a technologist or a business person, entrepreneur who has a great idea and solution. Is that one? I think it's right now we live so there's multiple challenges. One is that we live in a time where hospital administrators, people in the public health system, they are overwhelmed, right? Like there is no doubt that a large portion of their time is spent putting out fires and dealing with a rapidly increasing demand for healthcare services and complexity of patients to care for in a setting of fewer and fewer resources, right? So I think recognizing that that environment is important and being empathetic towards that as an innovator is important, and understanding that people are somewhat overwhelmed on a day-to-day basis in many ways, especially, and again, I'm speaking mostly from my acute care hospital experience. So that's one challenge to overcome, and I think the way you overcome that is a multi-pronged approach, trying to cold emails, LinkedIn, through multiple people who may be close to or related or working closely with the ultimate decider, right? And so sometimes it's not, it's a multi-step process, right? It's a warm intro to someone who may then give you the warm intro to the person who ultimately you want to get in front of, and that can be challenging. And also being really empathetic to their needs and understanding. So rather than upfront selling an idea, understanding that, recognizing that you're asking for in a meeting to learn more about their pain points, right? Rather than jumping to a solution, right? So you may have a solution in mind, a product you're trying to sell, but focusing on an initial call as an exploratory opportunity to better understand their current needs and current problems, and that may also help define or better inform how you position your product and your value proposition. The second problem in Canada, and I think this is changing, and I think I have a lot of optimism for the direction we're going, is that we tend to be very culturally conservative and networking and cold sort of intros and having conversations with people who you have never met before is just not something that we have in our culture. And having now spent a significant time trying to build a network in the U.S. without having ever worked there, I find our neighbors to the south tend to be much more open to conversations with people they've never met, even if there's not a clear goal or potential benefit. It's taking that initial sort of 15-20 minutes to have an exploratory conversation like the one you and I had first when we first started chatting, and seeing if there's some opportunity to work together, right? And taking that risk, that small investment in time for a potential large outcome, which may not happen with every interaction you have, but doing it more frequently. I think we have to build that culture. I think typically from a physician perspective in Canada, when you look at physicians and the roles that they have that are typically considered sort of desirable, honorable, noble, beyond being a good clinician, right, is being a healthcare leader in a hospital, in the public system, being an educator, being a researcher, right? Those three things by far have carried the greatest weight. If you think back to even your med school applications and the advice you got, people, you got to do research, work with these academic educators, show leadership, right? I think entrepreneurship, innovation, the ability to create new ways of thinking, new ways of caring for patients, and sort of social advocacy. Those things have traditionally had lesser sort of importance or credibility to the people in power, right? I think that's changing. I think over COVID in Canada, we saw a lot of clinicians publicly advocate for health equity, for better care for their patients, and the Overton window or the cultural norms towards how that was received have changed, right? I think we have a lot more physicians on social media, physicians publicly speaking about social justice issues, and that has changed the way we look at the importance of that as a potential role for physicians, which is great. I think entrepreneurship is a little behind, right? When we think about innovation, we think about research, we think about leadership, we think about social change. We don't think about entrepreneurship right away, that connection doesn't exist culturally as much. And I think that is slowly changing. And with that, that means the reception of people in the healthcare system to individuals like yourself who are trying to make a difference at a macro level in our healthcare system through entrepreneurship, through technological innovation, will change. And I think speaking to colleagues of mine who are much more experienced and successful in this space as physician innovators, physician entrepreneurs, if they look back to 20 years ago and compare it to now, I think overall we're headed in the right direction around how we receive that and the importance of having physicians take risks to build new things to better care for patients and add economic value also to our society. And so I think we're headed in the right direction.
Just to backtrack a little bit, you talked about the decision maker. I wanted to clarify. Do you find that there's usually one decision maker who signs the check, or do you find that there are multiple decision makers across different departments that you have to somehow coordinate with in order to implement any single solution?
Yeah, those are two questions. Absolutely. Sorry, I'll start again. So. Absolutely, there's often multiple decision makers, which makes the end user of the payer that much more complicated, right? It could be multiple institutions, it could be multiple levels within an organization, multiple silos, so multiple departments that are affected. The classic example in a hospital is the IT department, your finance department, and then your clinical leadership, right? All have to be aligned, and because of the way our hospital systems work as not-for-profit private entities that are publicly funded, the return on investment, the risk reward, the appetite for taking on new projects that may increase costs with a benefit that may be hard to measure is difficult to sometimes measure and approach and make a good case for. The other thing is, as a physician, I would say it's rarely the physician who is the decider. It's rare for physician leaders to actually hold on to significant budgets. So as physicians, there's this additional complexity that you may have a physician decider that you have to try to convince, but then ultimately they're not the payer. And so again, it's a multi-pronged approach.
What do you think about the role of accelerators and incubators, in forging these relationships and, maybe springing out of hospitals and, having some kind of formal arrangement? I know that a lot of them are springing up across the province and across the country. Have you identified any ones that you think are really good at doing that? Do you think that they're useful in any way for young people who are trying to start something to join? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, and I think they're absolutely useful. Having an ecosystem, resources, advisors, people who can give you warm connections is great. I think the exact formula that works best, I think in Canada we're still trying to figure that out. I don't think there is a perfect formula out there yet, because I think what's important, you want to give people infrastructure resources to support them in their early steps of making a product, right? You want to then be able to add additional resources to now sell, market, create warm connections for pilots, and then help them with investment, right? Investment in the product in order to ensure that they can grow to a point where they can actually provide those initial clinical validation and pilot projects to their clients, right? So there's multiple potential things an incubator and accelerator can do, and to do them all is difficult, right? So I think throughout Canada now there's examples of regional, provincial, hospital level, national programs that I think are all trying to figure this out still. I work at the Brampton Venture Zone, which is part of TMU's Zone Learning, so it's part of the larger Zone Learning ecosystem at TMU, and it's not directly affiliated to a healthcare provider, although there's multiple partners and people like myself who work at a hospital system who can then provide those warm introductions, and I think has been reasonably successful. So we've had, from our last couple of cohorts of digital health products, multiple pilot projects started in health systems, and some pretty interesting, exciting startups that have produced an MVP and been able to get at least to the validation stage.
I should probably look into that incubator and see if I can get it.
It was a very smooth plug to where I worked for. But I think what Brampton Venture Zone is doing is a great example of both building warm connections with multiple healthcare providers and institutions, while also having a bit of the educational infrastructure component through the university, and then also maintaining a bit of a distance from, or being agnostic to any specific healthcare institution.
You mentioned that there were different pathways to get a product incorporated into the healthcare system. You talked about research, you talked about pilots. Can you talk about a little bit more about those pathways? And next, can you talk about how a startup moves away from being stuck in that pilot phase? Because many hospitals are willing to pilot a product, but to actually buy the product, that's the problem. So they can pilot it forever, but in order to grow, you need actual customers who are actual paying customers. So I wonder if you can talk about that.
Yeah, so I think the biggest challenge, and that's, one of the things that a lot of people are working on in Canada, I think we're improving, is to avoid this sort of perpetual pilot-itis that exists, right? I think as a startup where you have to make a lot of decisions early on that are sort of key to the existence of your startup, choosing a initial pilot site, one of the biggest factors should be that there exists a path to implementation beyond pilot, right? And so early on, making sure that the pilot sites that you're working with that are interested in piloting your product, you've talked about a potential pathway, and that the pathway makes sense to you as a startup founder. There's clear, whether written or verbal, understanding of what the next steps would be should the pilot be successful to guarantee your first customer. So I think those can be tough decisions, because I think there's a pressure to just find at least someone who's willing to pilot your product. But I think holding back and being selective so that you can make sure you don't get stuck in that rut of just perpetual pilots is really important, because ultimately you have fixed resources, and so the first few decisions you make and where you invest your time and money are so key to the potential existence of your startup. Research, I think it depends on the product. I think we are at a time where, and rightfully so, clinical validation of patient-facing products is necessary, right? And so, first of all, knowing whether your product is whether it's a software or medical device, it is actually requires Health Canada or FDA approval. If you're in the US, is really important to early on go through those requirements and understand, if it's for instance a software product, is it actually a digital therapeutic, or is it just a software that's going to help clinicians support patients, right? And so going through the regulatory requirements early and making sure that you know what you're producing is very important. And then with research, again, I think there's a lot of opportunity for clinical validation funding, non-dilutive funding through various federal and provincial programs. Getting on top of that early, in a sense, for where you qualify and bringing money with you to any research project is very helpful in just getting the project off the ground, and to supporting your startup through what will be a very expensive phase of that journey, right? Hospitals, especially, again, focusing on what the sort of the space I work in, don't have budget room to add additional costs of new products, right? Especially if it takes a lot of time on integration, on IT or project management or personnel time. And so bringing funding with you is very important. I think there's a balance between finding credible PIs who have long research careers and credibility in the research world, and the length of time it takes to get something off the ground in their institution, right? So the more academic an institution, the longer the R&D process is. And that is not to say that other hospitals or health systems don't have rigorous R&D processes, but getting a sense for how long the typical process is upfront by talking to people in that institution is very important, because you may choose to work with a principal investigator who has really good credibility from their career and previous projects and research publications, but then your project takes 2.5, 3 years to get off the ground. So balancing that with working with principal investigators who may be lesser known, but work in an environment where they can get things done quickly, I think is important. Ultimately, and maybe a little on the extreme end in this comment, I don't think having a superstar researcher is a priority for startups. I think good study design, getting REB approval, and just getting off the ground and being able to iterate and get an early clinical validation. I think speed is definitely of the essence. And so if you're going to go down the research route, you don't want to get stuck in a 2, 3, 4 year process. That's basically right. It's going to be incredibly hard to stay afloat as a company and grow and pivot and iterate at the rate that you want to.
Yeah, you've talked about the benefits of the US. You've talked about how they're more open to these kinds of conversations. So maybe talk a little bit about your experience interacting with people in the US, how open the market has been for you. If there are any pros to starting in Canada, or if you think that it's easier to launch in the US first, or can you talk about the differences and what benefits Canada has over the US, if possible?
Yeah, and I think ultimately looking at it at a less of a Canada versus US versus finding a specific local market in which you can clearly get early traction. You have champions, clinical champions, or health system champions that you can work with to get launched is much more important than whether it's a Canada versus a US thing. I think just overall clinical entrepreneurship in medicine is far ahead in the US in terms of the openness to trying new things, the investment opportunities, the willingness to speak to early startup founders. I think you can make that generalization. There's a lot more opportunity in that regard, and then obviously the size of the market is much larger, so the ability to scale is much different than in Canada. That being said, I think there's a lot of pockets now in Canada, places where people are, as a system, recognizing that the current way, the status quo of operating isn't going to work, and let's invest in trying new things. And so I think more important than anything is when you're choosing your initial market is, do you have this clinical champion? Do you have the leadership champion who is willing to fund a pilot or early research project? And that can happen in Canada as well as the U.S. And so, speaking of my own experience with working with FirstHx, we've found a lot of early success and support in New Brunswick, for example, which is a health system that is actively looking right now to innovate and respond to the needs of their patients, with several burning platforms, including an incredible shortage of primary care clinicians to support the primary care needs of their community. And being a smaller province with a pretty centralized healthcare authority makes it a lot easier to get things started. So I think as Canadian startups, there's a lot of opportunity within Canada to start off and just be mindful that it may not be in your own backyard, and be open to exploring our vast country, and also then similarly looking south of the border.
Yeah, maybe talk a little bit more about your experience with FirstHx. One thing that's difficult is, finding a team, finding talent, finding co-founders, finding advisors. It's not just, you can't just work with anybody. Oftentimes you have to have people that, I say you pass the vibe check. You're comfortable working with them, and they also have to have a diverse set of skills from what you have. And so these are not necessarily people who have been in the industry but someone who, someone with business skills, someone with tech skills, and it's actually very much more difficult than it sounds, just finding a person that has the same passion, the same vision as you do. And so maybe talk a little bit about how you joined FirstHx, and, how founders can build that kind of a team.
Yeah, I think I've been very lucky, and it's been an awesome experience. I've been working with FirstHx for about just over a year now, and I think broadly, when I look at opportunities in my clinical, non-clinical career, there's three things that I always try to check. One is, am I working with nice people that I like? Is the problem interesting, and can I provide value to this to solving this problem? And so that's just a sort of a rubric I would use in general for any opportunity I take in my professional life. Right? Do I meet those three criteria? And with FirstHx, absolutely so. And I think what's really exciting with FirstHx is that we're solving a very clinical problem. Right? The way we take medical histories from patients hasn't changed in 200 years, and with the advent of cloud-based computing, now with machine learning, the potential, there's a huge opportunity to change the way we take medical histories from patients, and change the way the synchronous clinical encounter, whether it's a virtual or in person, can be optimized for what really matters for that human interaction, building rapport, answering questions, talking about next steps, and taking out some of the data gathering part and standardizing that, and improving how we get a patient story from or get the best history the first time, right? And so I think being a clinical problem, we've chosen to build a team that's very clinical heavy, which of our 5 executives, 4 of us are clinicians, and it's an awesome team. We have a CTO who's was a classmate of mine, at Rotman and is a fantastic CTO who's done this before. Our CEO, Chris O'Connor, this is his second digital health startup, so he's been through the process. And then my other colleagues, Beth and James, have worked at previous digital health startups or in government and regional level, making macro level changes in healthcare. And so our team, from that perspective, is well suited for addressing a clinical problem. Startups are hard, and like any other startup, we have our unique challenges in a pretty open, growing space. But overall, it's a very exciting time to be working with such a fun group of people who we all are aligned on how we see this problem solving. And I think one of the things that keeps us motivated and together and working is our shared vision. So we all have the same clinical philosophy and approach to how we think we should be modernizing the way we get the patient's story the right way the first time.
So is there any hope for an introvert in this world of networking and meeting people and trying to sell? Because like we've talked about, it's less than half the job is building a superior product. A big part of it is finding a market. You talked about going to New Brunswick, going to the States, finding a local market, interacting with people, finding advisors, finding co-founders. I'm an introvert, so that's a little bit more difficult for me. So I'm content with working on products. I'm content with trying to build, but that's a huge piece that needs to be filled. And I wonder what you would advise an introvert to do.
Well, first of all, I think you're doing a fantastic job of networking and working on meeting people and trying to build your team. So kudos to you for working through that. I think there's never been a better time it's never been easier, I think, for introverts to reach out through the safety of technology, whether it's via email, LinkedIn, other social media channels, to start networking. It's not all about just going to big conferences and working a busy room, right? That is draining for a lot of us. And a challenge, right? And so with technology and remote work, and I know, for example, you have a team halfway across the world that you're working with. It's never been easier, and I think the safety and comfort of working working through digital communication, I think, makes that a lot better. I think ultimately it's not about whether you're an introvert or extrovert. I think finding a project that you're really passionate about, right, will motivate you to push through your own personal challenges or barriers that we all put on ourselves, right, to succeed. And so don't settle for something that you're not passionate about, especially as an entrepreneur, as a startup founder, because it is so hard in such a high risk, high reward scenario, right? If you're not really, really passionate about what you're doing, as a first step, right? That's going to make it very challenging. And then two, like I was saying earlier, take your time finding like-minded people, right? There's no sense in working on a project you don't like with people that you're not comfortable with, right? And so I think one of the beauties of entrepreneurship and taking this path is that you get to choose your own path, right? Mm-hmm. You're not forced to do anything, and so finding people you're comfortable with, finding people who complement your skills, right? Mm-hmm. And so perhaps finding individuals who may be more comfortable with more in-person networking, sales, public speaking, etc., is obviously something that is very doable through modern technology, joining Slack communities. Mm-hmm. Using social media, LinkedIn, etc. Mm. And I think if ultimately, like for me at least, I find myself most energized when I'm working on something that I really, really enjoy, right? And having the privilege as a physician to do a job that I love, and then also take on opportunities outside of my clinical practice and be selective is a real privilege.
So you talked about, joining Slack communities. There are some Substacks you recommend, some blogs you follow, attending conferences. Can you talk a little bit about, these specifics of, the way you can an entrepreneur can put their ears to the ground to hear about opportunities, to know what's going on in different places and where to be at the right time?
So, I definitely would put out a plug for Health Tech Nerds. It's a Slack community started in the U.S. That I found very valuable, and met some really interesting people. And it's all focused on health tech, the health tech ecosystem and startups specifically, and a great group of people all aligned with a common mission. So that's something that I would start with. There's endless opportunities for in-person conferences. Just finding something that aligns with the area you're interested in, whether it's a clinically focused conference in your area that you're trying to innovate in, or a tech specific conference. There's like endless opportunities, and so picking ones that work within your schedule, your budget, cities you like to visit. There's enough. There's more than enough out there for that. I think locally finding in-person opportunities is important. That balance between your broader sort of digital community that you can create beyond your geography, and then working locally as well. Mm. Is that helpful? I don't know if you want to give me a little more specific.
No, I think you can be a little more specific if you want. That's fine.
Yeah, I don't want to really plug a whole bunch of random
that's cool.
conferences, right? So
yeah, that's cool.
Health Tech Nerds is good. I do think it's a worthwhile investment for anyone in health tech innovation.
So you do a lot of stuff. You talked about the incubator that you're part of. You had a strategy at FirstHx. I know you are part of building. I think it's for TMU also, the med school at TMU. I think you're an advisor on Emergency Response Africa. So tell me how your day-to-day looks like. What amount of time do you devote to clinical work, and how do you share your time among all these things?
Yeah, it's a challenge, and something that I constantly reevaluate, because the last thing I want to be is someone who's spread too thin and I'm doing a whole bunch of things poorly. Yeah. And I think it's really important to me that I don't get to that place. I'm very lucky and privileged, to be an emergency doctor who can easily up and down shift on the number of clinical hours I put in any month. It's quite flexible and easy to change that up, and I've been working for almost 15 years now, and so it gives me the opportunity to be comfortable with having months where I do part-time work, a little less than full-time, or full-time work. And so I think a career in emergency medicine, first of all, in terms of clinical practice, is very unique and awesome for those who have multiple interests. And then beyond that, I just make sure that on a monthly basis, I'm reevaluating, are the things that I'm doing bringing me joy? Am I energized by them? Am I committing to an appropriate amount of time for what I would like to do well? And so I think it's important not to be again over-committed and underperforming. And so I'd like to think I'm doing an okay job of that right now, and it's something that I continuously evaluate. And the way I look at it is, life is short. You gotta make the most of it, and do stuff that you find fun and meaningful.
Mm. Yeah. My last question, you talked about, the noble fields of medicine in Canada, the clinician, the academic, the researcher, and you talked about how entrepreneurship is lagging behind. So I want you to talk about what you would say to a young medical student or physician who wants to be an entrepreneur, what they should do, what should be the first thing they do.
Well, I think, first of all, just like this idea that there's only a few certain paths in medicine, I think it's propagated by very conservative educational institutions and the initial mentors that we have as medical students, and also the admission policies of our medical schools, right? And so it's a perpetuating cycle. If you think about who we are exposed to as physicians, it's a very small subset of the physicians out there practicing and doing great things. And so opening up yourselves as a pre-med or a med student to new experiences, or trying to actively find clinicians who are doing stuff that you find exciting and cool, and connecting with them, I think, is really important, so that you build those mentorship opportunities, and you can be inspired and excited and learn from people who have kind of done things that you would like to do further down your career. I think anyone who the bottom line is our healthcare system has leaves a lot to be desired. I think we have a lot of room for improvement and opportunity. And so anyone who's a clinician, or anyone who's not even a clinician, who wants to make a difference in healthcare, regardless of the path they choose, whether it's social change, government work, working as healthcare leadership, research, education, or even clinical medicine itself, I don't think we should be so judgmental, right? And I think entrepreneurship is just one way of trying to influence macro level change in a system that, again, there's a lot of opportunity. There's no shortage. Just think back to your last experience as a patient, or a family member's last experience as a patient, or right? There's no shortage of ways to try to improve the system, and so figure out what excites you the most, and then find like-minded people who can support you, and try to, as a medical student especially, try to reach out beyond the walls of sort of the immediate sort of clinicians that you're exposed to, because there is quite the diversity of clinicians out there doing a lot of cool things all over Canada.
I still have one more question. So does this, you talked about the conservative nature of our institutions, does this reflexive repulsion, I would say, to the profit motive, privatized healthcare, and a suspicion that's attached to, even telemedicine platforms? As long as there's a profit motive, I find that many in Canada are suspicious of such an activity. And I wonder if there's something you've encountered and how you've navigated that at First History.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I've made an active decision to be part of a startup over my previous work, which was largely in health system leadership at a hospital level or regional level. And so I've thought about this a lot and heard a lot of people's opinions about this. And I think ultimately, I think it's a very sort of the suspicion, or the root cause of the suspicion, is also it's hard for me to understand, to be honest, when you delve deep into it, because ultimately, whether you work for a startup or whether you work, doing clinical work as a research academic, you're getting paid for the work you do, right? And so, okay, let me take a step back. That's a really hard question. Let me just think about this for a second.
Okay. I asked this because I popped into sort of a debate that William Cherniak of Rocket Doctor was having with someone else, and it was the allegation that just kept popping up, the profit motive. It was like, it wasn't really about what the outcomes are. It's just about the hypothetical dangers of the profit motive, and how it should be resisted.
So the argument about the hypothetical profit motive and the dangers of that exists in just clinical medicine, right? We work in a fee-for-service environment, mostly in Ontario. We're a single insurer, but doctors get paid for the more work they do, right? Mm-hmm. There's opportunities and incentives in the way the system works for bad actors and good actors, right? Mm-hmm. Similarly, in academic medicine, there's, in research, there's bad actors and good actors, right? Every week we hear of new studies that are not replicable, or data's been faked, for personal gain, right? Like, so there's bad actors and good actors regardless of the incentive structure, right? In entrepreneurship, the incentive structure is, can you provide value, and then can you extract some value to continue to sustain your business, right? And so there are going to be entrepreneurs who try to extract more value than they create, right? And some may be successful in our system, and some may achieve some success and then rightfully be squashed for the work they do, right? And so ultimately, as an entrepreneur, your goal is to provide value, right, to society, to the healthcare system, improve outcomes, right, and then extract enough value from that to be able to continue to sustain, improve, and grow your business so you can provide more and more value, right? And so it's not the profit motive that's the problem. It's what your personal intent and integrity and goals are, right? And so I believe if you're a good actor, whether you're, seeking to become a CEO of a hospital, work as a researcher in an academic institution, work for a non-governmental agency to further social change, or an entrepreneur, you can do good in all these avenues equally, just as equally as you can do bad, right? And so I don't really think that the argument for the dangers of for-profit companies improving care holds much water. I think it's the wrong argument. I think we need to make sure that wherever we work and whatever system we try to create, we have enough regulation and roadblocks to prevent bad actors from getting too far in whatever work they're doing, whether it's research, whether it's teaching, whether it's entrepreneurship or social advocacy, right, or clinical care, right? We need to make sure that our system is robust enough to prevent bad actors from getting too far regardless. And so I think that's a more important question than the dangers of entrepreneurship. I mean, we can't function without, like, if when I go on shift tomorrow, right, in the emergency department, I'm going to use a computer built by a for-profit company, right? I'm going to use a stethoscope built by a for-profit company, my scrubs, the needle used by to inject medication, the medication that I'm going to prescribe, all these are created by for-profit institutions, right? You can't function without them. So I'm not quite sure that being a clinician entrepreneur in it itself is a bad thing. I think, you can do a lot of good in society by building better products that are using your clinical knowledge to make sure that they're driving positive results for patients, the system, and then our sustainable businesses. Hope that answers your question.
Yeah, it does. Thank you very, very much for speaking with me. It's been really helpful, and I'm sure it's going to be helpful to anyone who listens to this. It's been a pleasure.
Likewise, man. Always good to chat with you.